Opposition is growing after Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith signed a memorandum of understanding that sets the stage for a new pipeline to the west coast of BC. For some First Nations leaders, the prospect of sending another pipeline to the BC coast is bringing back memories of previous pipeline disputes of years past. But for many youth, it's a new call to action. So I spoke with Katisha Paul, who's the youth representative for the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and she told me that she sees this MOU and a potential pipeline as a continuation of her family's responsibilities of standing on the front lines and defending the land from what she sees as complete resource extraction without any protections for the land. Longtime Union of BC Indian Chiefs Grand Chief Stuart Phillip has been around for many of these acts of resistance, mounting opposition to the failed Northern Gateway pipeline and other resource extraction projects he say threatens his community's way of life and of those of Canadians. So the MOU signed last week between Carney and Smith commits them to working toward an oil pipeline to the west coast and opens the door to removing the tanker ban. The MOU says that Ottawa's commitment is contingent on the pipeline being approved as a project in the national interest and that Indigenous participation is required. Despite that requirement for Indigenous participation, no First Nations were consulted on what the MOU would look like, leaving some chiefs who were in favor of a pipeline disappointed that they weren't included in what the parameters would look like in getting a project moved forward. I spoke with an Indigenous resource lawyer, Merle Alexander, who said that First Nations weren't necessarily owed the duty to consult on the MOU unless the governments were interpreting it in its most progressive form. He said that if this ends up in the courts, as leaders are suggesting to me would happen if a pipeline is sent to the Major Projects Office and eventually attempted to be built, that First Nations would need to be a little bit more creative in the legal arguments that they're bringing forward. So both Katisha Paul and Stuart Phillips have said that they expect it to end up in the courts, but Merle Alexander was explaining that if the government does meet a strict definition of the duty to consult, First Nations are going to be a little bit limited unless they have rights entitled to the land. And in British Columbia, First Nations have done a pretty great job at proving that title through the courts for the last decade. So, for example, if a pipeline is going to the coast and it goes near Haida Gwaii, the Haida just this year have signed an agreement with Canada and the province that recognizes title to, I believe it's 1 million hectares of land, which would transform the duty to consult into something more like consent. So there can be new legal arguments that are brought forward in the courts for this case that can see it stalled entirely if First Nations bring forward the arguments that I'm hearing them talk about now.